Welcome everyone to the webinar. This is How to Improve Your Comprehension. I'm Paul Nowak, the founder of Iris Reading. I want to thank you all for joining us today. We actually had a fully registered, we had to close the webinar. We're able to register about 200 people. Actually, that's our max for the webinar. So those of you that registered early and came early, thank you so much. We're going to get right into it. I want to help you improve your comprehension. As a lot of you know, our bread and butter here at Iris Reading is helping people to read faster. So we teach speed reading techniques. However, we place a strong emphasis on comprehension because if you're going faster and you don't understand what you're actually reading, that's a huge problem. That's not really reading. That's more like skimming. So in this webinar, we're not going to focus so much on the speed element. If you want to improve your reading speed, we do have other webinars on that. Some of you are probably registered for those webinars. We're going to dedicate this time entirely to comprehension. Now, I want you to know that while we're going along, if you do have questions during the webinar, I will be taking questions at the end, and you'll be able to, I'll pull up my contact information on the screen at the end once again. You'll be able to send me any emails that you might have with further questions later on. So let's get right into it. I want to start by discussing something that's very, very common among all readers. We've all had that situation where you ever read a full page of text and then you look up as though, and you just ask yourself, what did I just read? Or you can't remember what you just read. So I want to talk very quickly about spending less time rereading. This is a common habit that they sometimes call regression. And regression is simply rereading material that you already read, or maybe you read it but you weren't focused. So sometimes our brain wanders off. That's one reason why we might need to reread. Other reasons we might need to reread is just simply because sometimes if you're reading very technical material, there are some things that need to be read more than once to fully understand them or to understand them well. So I want to talk about how you can spend a little bit less time rereading. Here's a very common situation that'll happen. Someone will read a sentence and then they'll feel as though they didn't understand that sentence, so they reread it again and again. And have you ever had the situation where you read the same stupid sentence maybe 7 or 8 times and for some reason it's just not getting into your brain? This would actually be an example of a pointless regression. In other words, you should never go back after reading just one sentence. And let me explain why. Let's think about the possibilities. If you read a sentence and you didn't understand it, it's very possible that maybe I wasn't focused. That's possible. Another possibility, though, keep in mind, is maybe that material was not well written. Maybe that sentence was not well written. We've all experienced long run-on sentences. But here's a third possibility, and this happens all the time with reading, and a lot of people forget about it. Isn't it true that sometimes that sentence won't make any sense until you read maybe the next sentence or the rest of the paragraph? And a lot of people spend their time rereading that one sentence over and over and over again, and it's completely pointless to do this because sometimes you could reread those sentences a million times and you would not understand it because you need to maybe finish the paragraph to fully understand what's being talked about. So I just want you to keep that in mind. It's a very common thing that a lot of readers do, and the average person spends about 33% of the time rereading material, whether that's a sentence or a paragraph or a page. Now, when is it a good time to reread material? If you read a whole paragraph of text and you don't understand what you just read, then you should probably go back and reread the material, but don't do it after one sentence. I want you to think of it similar to when you watch movies. You ever watch a movie that's a little confusing at the beginning? You wouldn't stop your DVD player and say, you know what, let's rewatch that scene. Why don't you do that? Because you know that the way movies are, sometimes movies start out with a scene that's a little bit confusing. You're not supposed to know everything what's going on, and you're supposed to figure it out as you go along. And eventually, maybe in the middle of the movie or at the end, it all starts to make sense. And I want you to know that reading is very similar. Sometimes one sentence will not make any sense until you read the next sentence or the rest of the paragraph. So avoid rereading simply sentences. And it reminds me of a very common phrase. You've probably heard it before. When you get caught up in details, you lose sight of the big picture. So it's one of the very big problems with how people spend their time rereading material. Now, let's go over to a very simple way that you can improve your comprehension. So we're going to start off with very simple ways to improve our comprehension. Then we'll kind of build on that into more advanced ways. So the simplest way you can improve your comprehension is just using your hand as a guide. If you've been to our other workshops, either online or in person, this is one of the fundamental speed reading techniques. Use your hand as a guide. A lot of you are probably already familiar with that, so I'm not going to spend too much time on this. But using your finger or your hand or a pen while you're reading is going to be incredibly helpful because it simply forces you to focus on the material that you have in front of you. So you simply put your hand or pen on the page, and you go from left to right, line by line. Simplest way you can improve your concentration. And if you improve your concentration, what's going to happen to your comprehension? You're going to have better comprehension. And actually, most people, if they start using their hand as a guide or a pen, they notice almost an immediate boost in reading speed, sometimes 20% faster or 25% faster. So start using your hand as a guide. Now, I know the immediate thing that a lot of people will ask at this point is, well, what about reading on the computer screen? Because reading on the computer screen, nobody wants to be dragging their finger or a pen on the screen. And if you have a touch screen like an iPad, that's not really going to work well for you. So we recommend using an application that we created called Accelerator. And Accelerator, it's available at accelerator.com. It utilizes a reading technology called RSVP. The acronym stands for Rapid Serial Visual Presentation. And it's simply just a method of displaying text on a screen. So let me show you what I mean. I'm going to take a sample article here. Let's take this Onion article. Professor deeply hurt by students' evaluation. And the way that you use Accelerator is you simply highlight the material that you want to read. So I'm going to highlight this whole article. And then I'm just going to copy that material. And then you go to accelerator.com and you paste that material into the text box that you see right here. So we simply paste the material in there. We click the read button at the bottom. And then in the settings, what you can do is you can modify how fast you want to go. So it'll always remember your last speed that you had here. So by default, the application will show you 300 words a minute. And right now it says chunk size 2 words. Let me show you what this is like. This is 2 words at a time at 300 words a minute. Let's see if you can comprehend this material at that speed. So we've got this article, Professor deeply hurt by students' evaluation. We're going to run through the first few paragraphs, and then you can work with this on your own in the future. Here we go. All right, let me stop it there. You guys get the idea. So this is going at 2 words at a time at 300 words a minute. Now, one thing I do want to make mention of, Accelerator has a number of advanced settings that could actually improve your comprehension. Let me zoom in a little bit on the screen. If you click the advanced button down here, you'll get a few other settings. So one setting that we actually had enabled was start new chunk at the end of sentences and paragraphs. What this does, remember we told the application, show me 2 words at a time. Well, what if it gets to the end of a sentence or paragraph? When you get to the end of a sentence or paragraph, you wouldn't want to see 2 words. You would just want to see the last word. Actually, if you showed the last word of that sentence and then the first word of the next sentence, that could actually impact your comprehension in a negative way because it might be harder to understand. So if you enable this setting right here, make sure you enable that. That will, when you get to the end of a sentence, it'll show you the last word. So this works if you had 2 words at a time or 3 words at a time, whatever you want in that setting. Now, one other thing I want to make mention here was we also had this setting enabled, skip over stop words, which convey no additional meaning to the sentence. Words like the, and. The words that you have right here, you can actually edit this list. This is by default. These words right here, they don't give you additional meaning to the sentence. We know that they're there for grammatical purposes. So make sure you have something like that enabled while you're reading through. That'll actually enable you to go a little bit faster too because it's skipping over those words that you don't really need to see. And actually, if you were comprehending this article as we're blinking the words on the screen, I want you to note that that setting was enabled while you were reading the material. And if you were able to comprehend it, it's because these words don't necessarily give you any additional meaning to the sentence. Now, there are a few other settings that you can check out here. Speed variability, that can help you out with your comprehension. What this will do is slow down for larger chunks of text, and it's going to speed up for smaller chunks of text. And the average words per minute will stay the same. That's very useful if you're reading fiction, which has a combination of very short paragraphs and very long paragraphs. So fiction will have a lot of short paragraphs where there's dialogue. It might just be a 1 line or 1 sentence paragraph. And then you have larger chunks of text where maybe the narrator comes in and explains what's going on. So if you're reading material that has a combination of very short and very long paragraphs, you might want to enable this to improve your comprehension. And one other thing that could improve your comprehension is a slight pause at the end of sentences and paragraphs. That's another great way, because otherwise the application is just blinking words constantly on the screen at you. If you enable this right here, it'll do a slight pause when it gets to the end of the sentences and paragraphs, and that makes it a little easier to comprehend the material. So when you get a chance, check out accelerator.com. We're going to move on to another topic here. What are some other ways we can improve our comprehension? So I already mentioned that accelerator.com, that's a useful way if you're reading a lot on the computer screen. And using your hand as a guide, that's useful if you're reading on physical material, a printed page, maybe a magazine or a book. But what are some other ways that we can improve our comprehension? One way you can do it is by adjusting your reading speed. So this is a good rule of thumb to follow. Going forward, try slowing down on the first sentence of a paragraph and then reading a little bit faster after that first sentence. So essentially what I'm asking you to do is slow down on the topic sentence or the main idea. And then after that topic sentence, you take that idea and you try to run with it. So you go a little faster through the rest of the paragraph, which is going to give you the details based on that main idea. Now, when I say slow down or speed up, I don't mean go extremely slow. So I just mean go carefully through the first sentence. And then when I say go faster through the rest of the paragraph, I don't mean go at a speed that you can't understand the material. I just mean kind of like an acceleration. You can compare this similar to driving a car. You don't always drive at the same speed, and you shouldn't read at the same speed either. You should mix it up. Sometimes you should slow down, sometimes you should speed up, and this is generally a good rule of thumb, slowing down on the first sentence of the paragraph and then speeding up. Now, there are some situations where this kind of strategy might not work perfectly. So why do we slow down on the first sentence? It tends to be the main idea. But what if you're reading something where all of the main ideas are at the end of the paragraph? Well, then you can slow down towards the end of the paragraph. So you can easily modify this strategy, but the whole idea is still the same. You're adjusting your reading speed. You're slowing down and then speeding up. Now, let me explain another situation where the material might not be structured the way you might think. So generally, 80% of the time, the first sentence of the paragraph is the main idea. But that's not the case with reading news articles. News articles are structured differently. News articles are structured in what's known as an upside-down triangle or an upside-down pyramid. What that means is the most important information is always at the top, and it gets less important as you go through the newspaper article. So remember the strategy of slowing down on the first sentence and then speeding up through the paragraph? This doesn't work very well in news articles because news articles also have very, very short paragraphs. If you look at, the news stories on a daily basis, you'll notice each paragraph has maybe 1, 2, or a max of 3 sentences per paragraph. So what you can do instead, you can adjust your reading speed like this. You would go carefully on the first, so you'd slow down on the first paragraph, and then you would speed up a little bit on the second paragraph, and then you'd speed up even more on the third paragraph. So you'd be accelerating through this news article. And you could actually do this with the confidence of knowing that, let's say you went a little too fast and you didn't understand it well. Well, I'd rather be going too fast towards the end of a news article than at the beginning where the information is more important. So there is this balance that has to be struck, but I want you to keep in mind that news articles are written a little bit differently. Now, keep in mind, when I say news articles, I'm distinguishing news from something else that might be in a newspaper, such as an op-ed piece. The opinion pieces are a little more structured. They have a structure of first sentence being the main idea and then details following. When you're reading general news stories, maybe something that, maybe there was a crime that happened in the community. Those are written in this kind of an upside-down pyramid structure, so you want to keep that in mind if you're going to be adjusting your reading speed. Now let's talk about another comprehension concept, and this is the concept of previewing your material before you actually read it. What do I mean by previewing? I want you to think of it similar to, if I could bring up the movie analogy, what do you do before you end up seeing a full-fledged movie? A lot of people will see the trailer. And a trailer is a form of a preview. You want to get an idea of what the movie is going to be about. Am I going to see a horror movie, a drama, is it an action flick, is it a comedy? And the previews or the trailers allow us to know that. The same thing goes for reading. A lot of people don't do this. What they do with all their reading material is they just read it beginning to end. And for most reading material, that's probably the worst way you could read it. So what I'm suggesting here is if you're going to be reading material use this for informational material, you do some sort of preview of the material. What does that mean? Let me give you some examples. Here's how we would preview a magazine article. Let's say it was just one page and it had maybe about 9 or 10 paragraphs. Very short magazine article. What you can do is you can read the first sentence of every single paragraph, and that'll give you a very, very quick idea of what that article is going to be about. That's how you would preview a magazine article. So simply read the first sentence of every paragraph. Why the first sentence? First sentences tend to be main ideas. They give you a lot of information very, very quickly. Now, after you read that first sentence of each and every single paragraph, that's when you would go back to the beginning of the article and decide to read it fully. Or you might decide that maybe this article is not worth your time. So this could also be a form of a reading shortcut to kind of filter through the material to figure out what's worth my time, what's not worth my time. But if you do have a magazine article, don't just assume that it needs to be read beginning to end. Preview it first by reading the first sentence of every paragraph. And then if you decide to read it, go back and start reading it beginning to end. By doing this, think about it. When you read it beginning to end, if you've read the first sentences of every paragraph in that magazine article, you'll probably be able to read it with better comprehension. Why? Because you know what to expect in the article. Let's talk about previewing a newspaper article. And I'm trying to show you the difference between what might be like a traditional magazine article versus a newspaper article. Remember, we mentioned news articles are structured in this upside down pyramid where the most important information is at the top and it gets less important as you go down. This is actually a situation where if you were previewing a news article, you would go beginning to end. Why? Because the most important information is at the top. So for me, previewing a news article simply means reading the first 2 or 3 paragraphs and then deciding, do I want to read the whole thing? And if yes, then I'll read the whole thing. That's a very simple, straightforward way to read a news article. Now, let's talk about previewing a book. Let's say you have a whole book, and you've previewed books to a certain extent. Before you buy a book in a bookstore, what do you do? You usually read the back of the book, and maybe you read the table of contents. Maybe you read the preface or the introduction or the first chapter. That's one way of previewing a book, but I want you to think of another way, maybe a better way of previewing an entire, 200-page, 300-page or more book. What you can do, what I like to do, is read the first paragraph and last paragraph of each and every single chapter in the book. Now, you might not want to do this on fiction. I understand that. For like a mystery novel, you might not want to know the end because you don't want it spoiled. But think about all the informational material that you read. When I say read the first and last paragraph of each chapter, what I'm trying to get at is reading the introduction and the conclusion of each chapter. Now, if there's not a clearly stated intro and conclusion to the chapter, I'm just going to read the first and last paragraph. But if I do see something that's telling me at the beginning of a book, introduction, and there's a few paragraphs involved with the introduction, I'll read those few paragraphs and then I'll flip to the end. If there was a summary indicated, maybe by a heading, I would read everything in the summary. So that sometimes is a few paragraphs, sometimes it's just the last paragraph. But the idea here is before I start reading a book beginning to end, like a lot of people do, I'd rather just read the first and last paragraph of each chapter or the intro and conclusion to each chapter to get a quick idea of what is this book really going to be about. And that actually allows me to also evaluate whether or not it's worth my time to finish this entire thing. If you're a student, by the way, this might be a good idea to do at the beginning of a semester. You might want to preview your entire textbook or all the chapters that are going to be assigned in your syllabus throughout the semester. You would read the introduction and conclusion to each and every single chapter. So what about previewing on a Kindle? For those of you that do have a Kindle, I do want to make a quick mention of a simple way that you could read the first and last paragraph of each chapter or the intro and conclusion. But the Kindle has this nice little setting. Whenever you're in any of the books, if you click on the settings area, there's an option there to read the most popular highlights. The most popular highlights in a Kindle book are basically the parts of the book that have been highlighted the most by all Kindle users. So what's going on here? Amazon knows when you're highlighting text in your Kindle. I know this raises all sorts of privacy issues, but the idea, you can actually use this to your advantage. And you probably agreed to this, by the way, when you were speed reading through the terms and conditions. The idea here is that Amazon will tell you, hey, there are 1,723 people that all highlighted this one sentence or this one paragraph. Well, maybe that means it's kind of important. For just about all the Kindle books that are out there, Amazon will show you the top 10 highlights from the most highlighted to the least highlighted in that book. So what I like to do before I read any books on my Kindle is I'll read all of those highlights first, and then I'll start reading my book. So if you have a Kindle, there's a special situation that you can take advantage of there. And we already mentioned about previewing a textbook chapter. The way that you can do this is simply read the introduction and conclusion. So if you're a student and you have a textbook chapter, introduction, it might not say introduction, it might say objectives at the beginning, or maybe there's some kind of an outline, or maybe there's a little case study at the beginning. So you read something from the beginning, the intro, and something from the end, the conclusion, and that gives you a good idea. You've previewed what your chapter is about, and now when you start reading that chapter, it's going to be a little easier to understand it. And all of this kind of reminds me of a concept I learned a number of years ago called the 80-20 principle. Some of you might already be familiar with it. It's also referred to sometimes as Pareto's law or Pareto's principle. Pareto was this Italian mathematician who first initially wrote about this, and when he was writing about it in the context of wealth distribution in his country at the time, in Italy. And he estimated that 20% of the population had 80% of the wealth. And then he started writing about this 80-20 idea in other ways, not just as it related to wealth distribution, but also as it related to business. So some people give the example of how in a lot of companies, 20% of the products generate 80% of the revenues or the 80% of the profits. But the 80-20 principle applies in a lot more ways. It applies sometimes to the clothes that you wear. I would estimate for a lot of people, 20% of the clothes that they own, they wear 80% of the time. I know that definitely relates to me. Everybody has that pair of jeans, those shirts that they wear, and then you've got the more formal where you don't wear that often. The reason why I'm pointing out the 80-20 principle is because it also applies to reading. I would argue that 20% of your chapter could have 80% of the information, or 20% of your book has 80% of the information. Now, the 80-20 principle, it's unfortunate that it's commonly referred to as 80-20 now because it doesn't mean it's exactly 80-20. Another example of the 80-20 principle could be, 10% of your book having 50% of the information. Even though it doesn't add up to 100 or it's not exactly 80-20, the idea is that there's not everything is balanced out. There's this imbalance. And we know that there are some parts of the chapter that are going to be more important, some parts of the book that are more important. So I want you to think about how you can use the 80-20 principle to your advantage to improve your comprehension. And we talked about some ways by talking about a preview, how you would preview the material. If you're reading the introduction and the conclusion to your chapter, that's like spending 20% of your time and getting maybe 80% of the information. Or maybe it's not 20% of your time, it might be 10% of your time, and maybe you're getting 50%. That would still be an example of the 80-20 principle. Same thing goes if you were previewing on a Kindle. If you're reading the most popularly highlighted passages in that book, you're spending a very, very small amount of time and getting a lot of information. And that's kind of the essence of the 80-20 principle. So I want you to constantly be aware of how can you utilize this principle to improve your comprehension. So let's build on this idea of a preview. And we're going to discuss now a more systematic approach to reading. And this is called the multiple reading process. The multiple reading process is a 3-step process, and it all starts with the preview, which we already discussed. Preview is basically getting a general idea of what is it I'm about to read. So if you were reading, let's say, very technical information, let's say a textbook chapter, and you wanted to get an idea of what it was about, the way you could preview a chapter is by simply reading the introduction and the conclusion to that chapter. Now, after you're done with your preview, there is a second step that you can follow here called an overview. The overview is where you get kind of like the big ideas, the concepts. The overview is the step where you want to get an idea of how is this chapter structured. The way that you would do this in technical materials, you would look at every heading, subheading, and boldface word. You would look at maybe the charts and diagrams. You wouldn't fully analyze them, but maybe look at the titles of all those charts and diagrams. So whereas the preview was reading intro and summary, the overview, you're looking at those headings, subheadings, boldface words, anything that pops off the page. Now, let's say you don't have headings and subheadings in your material. What can you do on the overview? Well, you can read the first sentence of each and every single paragraph. And that's a quick step that doesn't take a lot of time, But it's a very effective way of figuring out what are the most important things that are going to be discussed in this particular piece of material. Now, I just mentioned how you could do preview and overview on a chapter. What if you were reading an article that was a few pages long or a research paper? Your preview would be reading, again, intro and conclusion. So in an article, that might be the first and last paragraph. In a research paper, that might be, if you have some kind of an abstract or executive summary at the beginning and maybe there's a conclusion at the end. The overview in that kind of material would be either first sentence of every paragraph or headings and subheadings. And I should say and or, because you can do a combination of these things. But I want you to think of the preview and the overview as just initial steps where you get an idea of what you're about to read. And then if you have the ability to decide whether or not you actually have to read this material, you can decide whether or not you want to do it at this point. If you're a student and you have to read this for class, well, then you have to go to step number 3, and that's just simply reading the material. But what's the difference with how most people read? Most people, when they read, they'll start with step number 3. In this process, notice how we're holding it off until we get a general idea of what the article or the chapter is going to be about. If you preview and overview the material, what's going to happen when you start reading that material? You're probably going to be able to read it a little faster than normal because you know what to expect. And what about your comprehension? You're probably going to be able to comprehend that material a lot better because you are expecting certain concepts to come up. So I want you to think of this 3-step process in a way that, very similar to before you work out or play a sport, what do? You stretch, you warm up. Think of step 1 and 2 here, the preview and overview, as the reading equivalent of stretching and warming up. And why do we stretch and warm up? So that when we play whatever sport we're playing, we can play at an optimal level. Why would we preview and overview? So we can read at an optimal level when we get to that 3rd step. So this is the multiple reading process. It's a very effective way of approaching material and getting better comprehension. I do know there are situations where if you're reading novels where you might not want to do this, but for most informational text, this is a great way to go through the material. For those of you that are interested in improving your comprehension further, we do have a comprehensive comprehension course with 25 class videos. It's got over 8 hours of unique content. The materials can be downloaded or you can watch them online. If you're interested in that, you can go to irisreading.com/online-courses. That's where you can get the content. Other courses that we provide, for those of you that are not already familiar, we've got courses on speed reading, productivity, memory improvement, focus, mind mapping. Mind mapping is a very effective way of taking notes. We do these classes online and in person, so if you do want to organize a workshop at your company or school or at your organization, you can send an email to support@irisreading, or you can contact me directly. My contact information is on the screen right now. If you want to reach out to me on LinkedIn, Facebook, or Twitter, by all means, feel free. And if you do have those questions that maybe they don't come up during this webinar, but they come up later in the week, if you want to follow up with me by email, by all means, feel free. And I want to thank you all for attending this webinar, and enjoy the rest of your day.